I'm not going to talk a lot about, if at all, about the current moment, but set it in a much longer history of political conflict through football in Israel and Palestine. And there are three moments that I really want to think about. The first is what happened in Mandate Palestine between 1970 after 1917. The process by which Israel, which began its football life as part of the Asian Football Confederation, came to be in UEFA, and thus playing an Israeli team will be playing Aston Villa. And thirdly, to think about Israel's behaviour with regard to football and Palestine in the 1990s and 2000s, and the case against Israel being in football at all at the moment. So to return to 1917, we don't have a lot of records of very much football in the region prior to 1917. Certainly, the occupying Ottoman Turks were not great football players. Certainly, in the army, football in Turkey was considered dangerously foreign by many and was confined for the most part to Istanbul and the Mediterranean coast. But from 1917 onwards, we do see a lot of football and we see a lot of politicized football, and it dramatizes all of the different conflicts going on in the region. So, the British Army, which is now the occupying power, is certainly playing a lot of football and has been playing football within its ranks for a long time. And we find also the emergence of many Jewish football teams, in part because so many Central European Jews are arriving in the region, and Central Europe has an incredible popular tradition of playing football. It would have been the norm for any young man of any ethnicity from Vienna or Prague or Budapest who came to Palestine in 1917. You would play football. So the first space in which football becomes politicized is actually amongst the Jewish migrants. And we find the formation of sports teams and sports organizations along the political lines of the separate Zionist organizations. So we have the Hapoels, who are connected to the left and the nascent trade union movement. We have teams that call themselves Maccabi, which is where Maccabi Tel Aviv of today is ultimately descended from, which are a more sort of centrist, liberal form of Zionism at the time. And then we have the Beitars, who are most definitely on the right, the more ultra-nationalist versions of Zionism. And they're all playing football against each other, and it's got a political edge, even in the 1920s. The second space in which football is politicised are the games being played by Jewish teams against the British Army. And the British Army, as you can imagine, and this is a story repeated in 100 colonial locations, the football pitch becomes a way of expressing resistance to what is perceived to be an illegitimate occupation. And we certainly have records of some, to use the contemporary vernacular, pretty tasty encounters between Zionists and the British Army. But we also begin to have records of Palestinian Arabs beginning to play football. And like everywhere in the world where excluded people see football being played, it's like, oh, I'd like to be doing some of that. That looks good. And that immediately takes on an inevitable political connotation. Um, this is enhanced in the late 1920s, excuse me, and early 1930s, when the Palestinian Football Association is formed. And the Palestinian Football Association is pretty much an exclusively Jewish organization in the late 1920s and early 1930s. And an application is made to FIFA to become part of the football world. And as again, with so many nationalist struggles, having a space in global football, having your nation on the pitch seems to be an essential element of the cultural politics of nationhood. And FIFA to its credit, does go back to the Palestinian Football Association and say, are you going to be open to everyone? Are you open to Arabs? Are you open to Christians? And the reply comes, oh, yes, everybody is invited. And on that basis, a Palestinian team competes in the qualifying rounds of the 1934 and 1938 World Cups. And in actual fact, of course, the team is entirely Jewish and they're wearing Stars of David. Forgive me while I have a bit of tea here.
Got
And
another 5 minutes, David.
as a consequence, we see resistance from Palestinian Arabs who attempt to form their own football association, who make their own applications to join FIFA. These, of course, are refused. This continues actually once the State of Israel is formed, and there are attempts again with support of Egypt and Jordan for a distinct Palestinian football association to be created. This is denied. So in the post-war era, there is just the Israel Football Association, which is now part of the Asian Football Confederation, as indeed, of course, its neighbours are Lebanon, Jordan, and so on. And in the 1970s, particularly in the aftermath of the Yom Kippur War, there is a number of states in Asia refused to play Israel, and eventually there becomes so many that there is a majority within the Asian Football Confederation, led by Kuwait, for expelling Israel from the Asian Football Confederation. And this happens, I think, in the mid 1980s. Israel then operates in a sort of weird no man's land in global football, where it competes as part of Oceania, hysterically, for World Cup qualification. And eventually UEFA accept Israel, the Israeli Football Federation, which, to my mind, as a kind of European colonial project, has a certain kind of justice that in the end Israel end up in UEFA. Um, this becomes much more politicized in the 1990s, and I think this, in a way, is the most important thing for today's discussion, is that the way in which Israeli football has operated for the last 20 or 30 years, the game between Aston Villa and Maccabi Tel Aviv should never have happened, because there is a very, very strong case for Israel being suspended from FIFA, suspended from UEFA, and suspended from international football. And this is irrespective of what has happened in Gaza and the politics of the last couple of years. We need not engage there to make a case against the Israeli presence. What is the argument? First, Israel has allowed teams from settler communities in the West Bank to take part in its domestic league. As far as the United Nations are concerned, this is allowing teams that are in another football jurisdiction, because of course there is a Palestinian Football Association established in 1998 and a full member of FIFA, to play in Israel's league. This is completely against FIFA statutes. It is totally and utterly unambiguous. And supported by the UN's rapporteur on sport, Willy Lemke. This is breaking international law. This is breaking FIFA statutes. If this were done by any other football federation anywhere in the world, they would have been out of FIFA faster than you can say Gianni Infantino. There is absolutely no ambiguity on this, and Israel once again is given basically a free pass. Secondly, Israel has systematically undermined Palestinian football by refusing to allow Palestinian athletes, Palestinian footballs to move freely, equipment to move freely. It's become virtually impossible for Palestine to have home matches. They've been playing in Qatar for the most part for the last decade and other locations. Once again, if any other FIFA member or indeed UEFA member were doing this to another football federation, they would be out. Thirdly, the Israeli state has systematically intervened in the running and the operations of the Israeli Football Federation, providing enormous diplomatic support to them when there have been efforts by the Palestinian Football Federation and its allies to bring this issue actually to the FIFA Council to be voted on. Again, if this level of political interference had been occurring anywhere else, Israel would have been, that country would have been out. Israel remains. And finally, and I think perhaps the most important thing for today's conversation, there is a terrible record of racism inside Israeli football stadiums. I have personally witnessed it. I have stood in Beitar Jerusalem Stadium, where literally every single person around me is singing "We Hate Arabs." Or they sang to their Croatian goalkeeper, Kali, who had been on television responding to some rocket attacks on Israeli settlements by saying, back in Croatia, when this kind of thing happened, we knew how to deal with it. You've got to do this. And so you had an entire stadium chanting in Hebrew, and I loosely translate, Kali for Chief of Staff of the Israeli Defense Force. This was just confined or primarily confined to Beitar Jerusalem in 2009, 2010 when I was last there. But we know from Football Against Racism and Extremism far that the level of racism being expressed in Israeli football stadiums is now much higher and has spread way beyond Beitar Jerusalem. I understand that they have recorded more than 70 incidents inside Maccabi Tel Aviv Stadium this season.
Mm,
This season. This is an extraordinary piece of information. I simply do not know how Justin Webb managed to go on Radio 4 and not put that point to the CEO
yeah.
of Maccabi Tel Aviv. So just in conclusion, just to say, as ever, politics has been with us a long time in this field. It's not surprising. Racism has been around for a long time in Israeli football. It's got very much worse. But irrespective of all of that, the way in which Israel has operated with regard to settler clubs and with regard to the normal business of the Palestinian Football Federation are absolutely, to my mind, watertight legal case under FIFA statutes and indeed UEFA's for Israel's suspension from international football of all kinds. It should never have come to the situation that we're in today. I just want to support the point Mark was making that when you're engaging in the politics of football, you've got to be football led. Most folks in the end are going to football for the football and they really don't want to think about politics. And actually, fair enough, right? So if you are going to engage, you've got to engage on football based arguments. And I think that was also true of the point Mark made about building support for the Palestinian national team and making a kind of narrative and engagement. I think that's a really powerful and important intervention and one that has been, missed, I would say. I mean, you do see this in other places. I mean, if you go to Celtic, of course, and Scottish football is a different culture, there's a whole different scene going on. And really, that's a model that we should be looking to. I also wanted to commend Kevin's arguments. I mean, I think the point that he makes about the problems of blanket bans and of providing a point of solidarity between racist ultras and then the wider Maccabi Tel Aviv fan base and beyond that is really important. And I also, while I noted in the comments that people don't care about the rights of fascists and racists, and I am sympathetic emotionally to that, I think it is politically a dangerous territory to get in. And I think we often, the use of the word apartheid takes us to the South African case. And what is interesting there in the sports politics of apartheid is that there was calls for the ban and for boycotting from within South Africa. And I think we miss an important point here. That's why that campaign was so incredibly successful and so difficult to undermine. And I think we need to be looking for allies within Israeli civil society. Of course, the majority perhaps today are racist and are ultra nationalists, but we should be looking about ways of making connections with their opponents within Israeli civil society. And I think the more you create ways of driving the middle ground towards the ultra nationalists, which is one of the consequences of a blanket ban undermines that element of the politics. And I don't think we should bear that in mind, that all these courses of action have their pros and cons.